Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and it's been a while since we've last done a PCB breakdown. Why is the... Okay, no, the brush is working fine. Anyway, been a while since we've done a PCB breakdown. Well, this is an MSI Lightning, not a new one, unfortunately. It's a GTX 780, but to be fair, I don't really enjoy looking at PCBs of GPUs I can't afford, and considering current GPU prices, that is basically everything. Well, no, it's more like I could afford them, it's just I don't want to pay for them. So, let's put it that way. Anyway, this is the MSI Lightning 780. Not the 780 Ti. There's a pretty big difference between the PCBs, and actually the 780 Ti never went public, but I do, well, it never went retail, but I do have pictures of that one, and we will be doing that one eventually. It's on the big, tall pile of things I want to do. Like basically everything else AHOC related. Anyway, let's get through this card here. VCore VRM is this gigantic block. Well, it's not really gigantic, but it is certainly very odd, like rather oddly laid out. So that's your VCore on the card. Above that, you have the memory VRM right here. And that's basically the two main ones. I think the PLL VRM is this, or, well, it can't, well, no, it's not that. PLL is this, I think, but the problem is, well, I'm working off of pictures, so I don't know for sure, and I can't read that, so it's not like I can actually check what that chip is, and I can't find any pictures of that area of the card either, so that kind of sucks. Anyway, that's your PLL. This right here is an LDO that's doing, well, that's a 1 amp LDO from, it's APL. I think it's ANPEC? Yeah, ANPEC. So ANPEC Electronics, and that's a APL 1117. There, that's how you make 7s when your 1s look like that. Anyway, and that provides the 1.8 volts for NVIDIA's BIOS system. Like, NVIDIA uses 1.8 volt BIOS chips, so that's what that's there for. It also powers some internal circuitry on the GPU, you know, minor stuff, but it's mostly for the BIOS chips. The card does have dual BIOS, which is why we have, well, I think those are the BIOS chips. These are probably the BIOS chips, since there's two of them. And they happen to be conveniently located by the 1.8 volt LDO. Moving on, oh damn, I just forgot that the other voltage controller is on the back of the card. Well, whatever. This video, like, I'm sorry if this video is even worse than usual. It's just like, I decided I'm gonna make it, like, I'm gonna finish this video today, and it's gonna go up, so... Be happy you have something, because I've kind of been in a, like, jam again in terms of, like, getting stuff done. So, VCore VRM, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And I just realized I have this, just remembered the source, the source for the image. Like, it's there, but it doesn't say that's the image source. So anyway, thanks to Tech Power Up for taking high-resolution pictures of GPU PCBs, because that's usually where I go to for these cards, and yeah. Anyway, let's keep going. So this is a, well, this looks like a 16-phase. Obviously, it's not a 16-phase, because nobody makes a 16-phase voltage controller. The deal with this is that that chip right there is that's a CHL 8318. Very popular chill voltage controller for the cards in, like, high-end chill voltage controller for cards from around the time this GTX 780 was made. So, this supports up to 8-phase output. And it goes from 200 kilohertz to 1.2, not 1.2, 1 megahertz. There. So, you know, not the world's biggest frequency range, but ultimately it doesn't really matter that much. because generally speaking, nobody like running a VRM in running MOSFETs at very, very high frequencies, like in excess of 500 kilohertz, generally just sends the efficiency to hell and doesn't actually get you any real benefits. So yeah, let's go for the doublers next. Those are these. And those, I'm not entirely sure exactly what chips those are, but I suspect these are IR3599s. And I'm basing that on the fact that these are some of the smallest, like, the 3599 is it does quadrupling as well as doubling, and it's extremely small. And basically, it's really dumb. PWM signal goes in to come out, and that's literally all it does. So it's pretty popular because of that, because it doesn't take up a lot of space, and it does double your phase count pretty very quickly, gets you a doubled phase count, but it doesn't support any advanced features. Very handy if you're using power stages, because for those you basically just want doubling the PWM is pretty much all you need. The issue with the 3599 is basically, assuming that's a 3599, it might be the 3599's predecessor. So the problem with the 3599 and such is that basically, if you want your current readings from each of the power stages, they basically get combined. So what the controller here sees is it sees one phase like that. That's one phase for the voltage controller. It doesn't see 14. It doesn't. Wait, how the hell does that work? 9, 10. Oh, I've done 2 10s. Okay, well that explains everything. There we go. Okay, well, at this point, I just give up. Anyway, the point is, it'll see 2 phases like one, so you won't get current balancing for every single phase. It'll be basically current balance in groups of 2, which isn't a huge issue. Like, obviously, it's inferior to having, like, a real 16 phase, but nobody makes those, so, this is, like, the best. In terms of phase count and control scheme, this is pretty much the best you can get. Now let's talk about the actual MOSFETs. Now, the MOSFETs here are power stages, and they are the International Rectifier 3553. These are 40 amp power stages. They're like they're pretty weak. End result is actually that I'm not really a fan of this VRM. It's nice that it's a 16 phase, but the problem, the problem I see with this is somebody at MSI basically went, you know what? We just need more phases. That's what we need. More phases. We don't actually need a good VRM. We just need more phases. Because the thing about the 3553s and their 40 amp current output is that if you wanted to, right, you can get a 12 phase, 12 3555s, or at that point in time, I think it was 3550. And while 12 times 60 is a lot more than 14 times 60. I mean 40 times 16. So, well, 16 times 40. There. So, because this, yeah, basically, you can get a more powerful VRM than this, on less phases than this. So to some extent, it was like we're doing 16 phases just for the sake of having 16 phases. Also, the VRM layout, having the phases in 2 separate rows like this is not really optimal for VRM performance and like transient performance, but well, it's still a nice enough VRM, and ultimately this is just his GTX 780, which is quite a lot less power hungry than a GTX 780 Ti. Those were GTX 780 Ti's might just be the most power hungry GPUs ever. Along with maybe the 980 Ti. It's like one of those 2 cards is the biggest power hog on liquid nitrogen. Anyway, in terms of actual current throughput that the 3553s need to be capable of doing, for stock, you're going to be looking at 1.15 volts. And I'm like, this really I did not think that through, did I? Trying to cram it over there. Anyway, stock is going to be 1.15 volts and about 175 amps. And, for that, you're going to be looking at about 17 watts of heat output. So really not bad. That's really not, like, that's fine. That's perfectly okay. Then if you start overclocking it a bit for like 1250 core-ish, you know, plus minus 50 megahertz or plus minus, like, I'm not sure. It's really hard to get statistics for GTX. Like, I've not really looked into NVIDIA cards much, you know, very often. So, especially not the 700 series. So I assume, well, basically, as far as I can tell, something around 1250 plus minus like 70 megahertz might be doable on 1.2 volts. I'm not sure. I might be a bit high on that, actually. It might be more like 1180 or 1150, but yeah, I don't know. I don't do NVIDIA cards much. So I am totally out of my depth on that. But 1.2 volts, 220, you'd expect around 225 amps, and incidentally, all of these power, like these current figures and the voltage figures, they're all run through a calculator. Actually, along with the frequency, they're just all run through a calculator, which is really reliable as long as you keep chip temperature constant. Which means it completely breaks down once we start talking about liquid nitrogen, because liquid nitrogen significantly reduces how much current stuff pulls for a given voltage, and the calculator isn't designed to accommodate for that at all. Anyway, so for, you know, 225 amps output, you'd be looking at about 27 watts heat output for that VRM, which again, like, that's really that's nothing, especially considering how massive this is. That heat output is spread across a huge amount of surface area, so it's not really an issue. Now, 1400 core and 1.4 volts is where, you know, it starts getting a bit toastier, but still pretty efficient. So 37 watts. Actually, right. Never enough space, is there? 1400, 1. Right, and I just made that even bigger than before. GG me. It's like complains about space, makes letters bigger to fill up even more space when he tries to get more space. Anyway, so 1400 core, 1.4 volts. Card should be around 300 amps, and you'd probably be looking at about 37 watts of heat output. Though, as far as I know, these kinds of clocks and voltages are only really viable on, like, water cooling. So, like, custom water blocks. So, in that case, well, I guess if you're running a core-only block, you better put a fan on the VRM, because that's a decent amount of heat. Shouldn't be, you know, super problematic, but that's pretty warm. And then we're getting into the LN2 territory, which seems to be somewhere between like 1700 and like 1850. Voltage-wise, honestly, there's barely any information. I saw some information, like I saw some people running 1.5 volts, and I guess you could probably push these things to 1.6. So I just went with 1.55 volts for the calculator, and now the calculator says that should pull around 400 amps, assuming, you know, it wasn't getting any colder. So this current figure is probably a bit high, because yeah, I'm not really sure. Because that basically means you'd have something like 600 watts going to the core, which after VRM power losses, which in this case, for 400 amps, you'd be looking at about 60 watts of heat output. You know, so you'd have like 660 watts going into the core. So also you have to, you know, keep in mind there's going to be memory power, and then all the various LDOs. And basically the card ends up being 700 watts. And I'm not sure if that's realistic or not. It might be. It might not be. So, yeah. But 400 amps, 1.55 volts, the VRM will produce about 60 watts of heat, at which point, yeah, you're definitely going to need some airflow over it. But the Lightning, what is cool is, as far as I know, it's shipped with a... so the card actually comes with like a, you know, a full cover plate that just covers the entire PCB, and then there's fins right above the above all the MOSFETs. But obviously, you're not going to run that on liquid nitrogen because that's a compatibility issue for LN2 pots. But the card, as far as I know, the card shipped with a plate that covered the VRM and basically ended right around here. So you could still run an LN2 pot and still have good VRM cooling, which, you know, if the card actually does pull 400 amps on liquid nitrogen, from the VRM, then yeah, that's a pretty handy thing to have, because it's going to kick out 60 watts of heat. And that's starting to approach the heat output of like, you know, like a CPU, a pretty powerful CPU at that too. So yeah, it does get hot if, you know, on liquid nitrogen, yeah, it will get pretty hot. But ultimately, it should be non-issue. And just for fun, you know, what happens if you really hammer the VRM? Well, for 1.6 volts and like 500 amps, you'd be looking at about 96 watts of heat, which should still technically be like just about handleable, based on the fact that there's like X299 motherboards which basically hit this exact figure on, like will hit this kind of heat output on liquid nitrogen, for the VRM. So, you know, it should probably be okay with that, but that's pushing it. And then absolute maximum, because keep in mind these are 40 amp power stages and there's 16 of them, which means the absolute maximum current throughput for the VRM before the power stages are, well, before you're going to need to start, you know, doing like extreme things to the VRM cooling, like say burying the VRM in dry ice, pouring liquid nitrogen on the VRM, and other unreasonable things to try prevent it from, you know, going poof. 1.6 volts, 640 amps, you'd be looking at about 172 watts of heat output, which is, like, that's huge. Like, that's absolutely monstrous. So yeah, that's definitely not viable. Past 500 amps, basically, this VRM starts producing so much heat, I wouldn't think it's like it would be okay with it. And even at 500 amps, you're going to need a lot of airflow. And it might not even, and even with a lot of airflow, it might not be viable to like run long benchmarks, because, you know, at some point the VRM heatsink's going to just saturate, and it's going to overheat. So that's the nice thing about a lot of the LN2 overclocking is, like, since the benchmarks aren't that long, if the VRM isn't, you know, if you have a heatsink that isn't capable of keeping up with the VRM's heat output, if it's heavy enough, it can, you know, keep the VRM cool enough to finish the benchmark before anything starts overheating really, really badly. And like, you can actually see this on like a lot of motherboards. Like, it takes a minute or two, sometimes even 4 minutes, even with like really garbage heat sinks. Admittedly at much lower heat outputs, but, you know, not anything near 96 watts, more like 10 to 20 watts. But even on like 10 to 20 watts with a small, you know, anemic heatsink and no airflow, it still takes several minutes before that heatsink gets so overwhelmed that the VRM starts hitting like 120 or 110 degrees centigrade. So, you know, if you're running a benchmark that's 4 minutes long and, you know, well, this area of the card is going to be frozen through because that GPU core is going to be sitting at minus 100 C, or close to that. You have a lot of, you know, you have a decent amount of time before the VRM gets so hot that it shouldn't be able to run anymore. Which is why these kinds of insane heat outputs on liquid nitrogen, like, there's not really any motherboards that actually handle it properly. Like, there's, so, like, if somebody did, I've not seen any tests proving that you can run like an X299 motherboard for, say, 30 minutes full load on liquid nitrogen. I don't think there's any motherboard that would actually survive that. Except maybe like the EVGA Dark, because that has like a, you know, proper heatsink. And I think the similar applies to GPUs. Like, if you ran the benchmark for long enough, the VRM would eventually just overheat. Because it's basically a time limitation. And like 3D Mark Firestrike and these kinds of benchmarks, like, they're really short. And then Unigine Heaven isn't really short, but it's not particularly hot. Firestrike's worse. 3D Mark 11's worse. TimeSpy's worse. TimeSpy's hotter. So Unigine, and even then Unigine Heaven is 4 minutes. So as long as you have airflow and some kind of mass over the VRM to make sure that it manages to not overheat before the benchmark finishes, you're fine. Which is why these kinds of like heat output figures, which on like in most normal circumstances would be completely unacceptable, are kind of okay. Anyway, memory VRM is a 3-phase, a real one, because you can't double into a 3, and I'm evidently very good at counting today. The MOSFETs are, well, three-phase. The control chip is on the other side of the board, I think around here somewhere, in this area. Actually, it might be this. Yeah, that looks like the ground pad for the controller. That's probably what that is. Anyway, so, you know, that controller in this area is a CHL 214, and that supports 4 plus 1, well, 2, 3, 4 plus 1 phase output. So here it's just running in straight 3-phase, 200 to 1.2 megahertz switching frequency, and that's 200 kilohertz down there, so 200K to 1.2 megahertz. And yeah, it's running in 3-phase mode here. The MOSFETs are International Rectifier IRF 8308s. So these are direct FETs from International Rectifier, and not great ones, mind you. These are like, I don't know, I didn't bother to check if they're like really outdated or something, but these guys need like, you can't run these on 5 volts. They really won't be happy with that. Like the RDS on that these have at 5 volts is just awful. For especially like this one is like 4 milliohms, which for a low side MOSFET is just massive, and then this one's like 8.5, which for a high side isn't terrible, but that's still really high. And also, there's a 5 volt regulator right here. This right here, that's a IR3897, and that's a 4 amp integrated buck converter. And that's basically there to power things like this VRM, because International Rectifier, you know, the 3553s run on 5 volts. These need 5 volts. So there's a 5 volt rail right here. But for some reason, there's a low dropout regulator right behind the memory VRM. So I'm going to guess that this is putting out, this right here, is there to produce 10 volts, so that these things are running in like optimum voltage range instead of running off of this thing and basically running like complete garbage. So, results. Well, the memory VRM for 1.6 volts, like, you know, memory, I'm assuming will, for like stock, you'd be looking at 1.6 volts, 20 amps, at which point the VRM will produce about 1 watt of heat. If you overvolt the memory to like 1.8 volts and, you know, overclock it a lot, you might be looking at sort of 30 amps output, and it will produce 3 watts of heat, which is nothing. So you don't have to worry about the memory VRM on this thing whatsoever. So yeah, this is like plenty overkill. And even if they didn't run it on 10 volts, well, basically the heat output would kind of go like double. But that would still not be like a huge issue, because this thing, again, it's large. International Rectifier direct FETs are like the whole point of these. Well, they actually aren't that great at cooling themselves, but because they're a like full copper package, if there's a heatsink on these things, they get like, they're really like, they're basically designed specifically for use with heat sinks, because the package itself is not actually that good at dissipating heat, even though it's just straight up exposed copper. It's just not big enough. But if you have a heatsink on these, like you should, because this has that, you know, heatsink plate, these will be just fine, even if they weren't running off of 10 volts like I think they are, because otherwise this LDO right here doesn't make any bloody sense, because there's nothing left on this card to power. Other than that, the card also has voltage read point plugins right here, which is nice. So you get vGPU, vMem, vPLL. That's handy. Oh, and the card does use an INA3221 current and bus voltage monitor. It's on the back of the card, so it's the same deal. That's why you have the 3 shunts around here. Same deal as like modern, you know, 10 series cards. That's the chip monitoring how much power the card is using. So if for some reason you can't get your hands on the like special LN2 BIOS for the Lightning, for this card, then, well, you know, shunts. There's a million and one ways to trick the INA3221 into believing that the power consumption is very, very low. Be that by throwing liquid metal on the shunts, or by soldering over them, or, you know, soldering 12 volt voltage. My preferred method of just completely disconnecting the INA3221 from the shunts, and then feeding it fake voltages from voltage dividers so that it thinks the card is pulling 30 watts regardless of what the card is actually doing. But really, that's up to you. Personal preference, in my opinion, for that, like what you do with that. So, yeah, that's that. In terms of capacitors, all these big cans are Nichicon FP5Ks. So, you know, they're Japanese. Japanese manufacturer. Incidentally, Nichicon's recently been caught for price fixing. Well, not recently, but they've been caught for price fixing capacitors. So, yeah, an interesting side note. And those are just FP5Ks, which is a pretty standard capacitor for Nichicon. They're not anything super special. Basically, they're just rated for 5,000 hours at 105 degrees centigrade. And actually, the FP stands for... well, the entire FP series is really meant for, like, switch mode power supply filtering, which is why they're so popular. You'll see them on a lot of motherboards, graphics cards, like, all over the place. So, yeah. And they're polymers. So, aluminum polymers. So that's that about those capacitors. Now, these, a lot of people would be inclined to think that they're tantalums. And me, a few years, like a year ago, maybe 2, would also believe that these are tantalums. But they're not. At least as far as I can tell, these are not tantalum capacitors. And I'm basing that off of the fact that I've seen Panasonic tantalums and I've seen Kemet tantalums. None of those, like, Panasonic does make aluminum polymers that look like this. So I'm going to guess these are, you know, Panasonic aluminum polymers, which is fine because those things are absolutely, like, so far from the capacitor testing I've done, those things are absolutely beast for filtering applications. But yeah, these are probably not tantalums, because Panasonic tantalums, at least, they have a white stripe on one end, like really, really white. Well, these don't look anything like those. And Kemet caps aren't labeled sideways like this. Kemet puts their labels that way. Like, you get one line, like, well, brand, no, series, model number, date code, I think, is their format. And Panasonic does size, something. So, yeah, these are probably aluminum polymer Panasonics and not tantalums like many people would believe based on the fact that these are flat. So, yeah, that's it for the card. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. If you have a comment about how terrible this video is, you can leave it down below and I won't care. Anyway, thanks to Tech Power Up for, you know, providing high-resolution PCB pictures. And, see you guys next time. Oh, wait, no. I have a Patreon, a PayPal, and, there's shirts. There's a link to all of those things down in the description. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, you should go check those links out. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. For real this time.